So Jocelyn Viterna is a professor of sociology and co-director of the Transnational Studies Initiative at Harvard University. Her research examines how social mobilization affects gender norms, gender practices in states, in welfare, in institutions, and in communities. Currently, Viterna is developing 2 new research projects. The first investigates the effects of revolution on the social organization of medicine. The second demonstrates how potential aid recipients in developing nations actively recruit transnational NGOs to place development projects in their communities, and details the consequences of winning or losing these local-level competitions for foreign resources. Viterna's work has been published in the American Journal of Sociology, the American Sociological Review, Politics and Gender, and the Latin American Research Review, among other journals. Her book, Women in War, The Microprocesses of Mobilization in El Salvador, 2013, Oxford University Press, won 4 distinguished book awards: the ESS Myrna Komarovsky Award, the ASA Section on Sex and Gender Award, the ASA Section on Political Sociology Award, and the SSSP Global Division Award, and won honorable mention, the ASA Section on the Sociology of Development. It's currently being translated for publication in Spanish. And our second distinguished guest this morning is Marlene Gerber-Fried. Gerber, right? Is a professor of philosophy and faculty director for the Civil Liberties and Public Policy program at Hampshire College, a program for education and activism about reproductive health, rights, and justice. She received her PhD in philosophy from Brown University. In 2010 to 13, she was interim president of Hampshire College. Her scholarship and teaching is focused primarily on abortion rights and access, reproductive and sexual rights and health, and legal theory. She edited From Abortion Rights to Reproductive Freedom, Transforming a Movement, and is co-author with Giles Silliman, Loretta Ross, and Elena Gutierrez of Undivided Rights, Women of Color Organized for Reproductive Justice, November 2004, awarded the Myers Outstanding Book Award by the Gustavus Myers Center for the Study of Bigotry and Human Rights, and is currently co-authoring a book on abortion with Loretta Ross. She is also a longtime reproductive rights activist and is the founding president and served 21 years on the board of the National Network for Abortion Funds, and also the founding president and continues to serve on the advisory board of the Abortion Rights Fund of Western Massachusetts. She works on abortion advocacy internationally, previously with the Women's Global Network for Reproductive Rights, and currently with the Women Help Women. She has received several awards for her activism, including Felicia Stewart Advocacy Award, APHA Population Reproductive and Sexual Health Section of APHA, Evidence and Activism Award, the IBIS Reproductive Health, and Women Warrior Award, Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. And in case you're wondering why I've been up here all morning, aside from being bilingual, I'm a midwife, and I've worked in Central America and Mexico training midwives, doctors, and community health workers on full scope practice from respectful maternity care and access to abortion. I opened birth centers in Mexico, in the highlands of Chiapas, Mexico City, and have supported birth centers in all of Latin America and currently in Haiti. Right now, I'm a doctoral student at the School of Public Health, and super honored to be under the wings of Alicia Yamin. So please help me in welcoming these amazing women that make the world a better place for all of us.
Thank you so much to my fellow panelists, to Alicia, and to the exceptional panels that have come before. I've learned so much today. I've been working for the last 25 years in El Salvador, and specifically about the last 6 years on cases of abortion and reproductive justice. And so I wanted to start out today talking about a couple of different cases that really illustrate how things have been changing in El Salvador. So I want to start out with the case of Maria Virtud. This is a case that I found in a 1991 newspaper article in the primary daily of El Salvador called El Diario de Hoy. And essentially what happened in this case was Maria was pregnant with her 8th child. She had gone to the health clinic. The doctor had said she was quite a ways away yet from going into labor, so the next day when she felt the urge to defecate, she didn't think much about it. She went to the pit latrine toilet behind her house, but she accidentally birthed the baby into the latrine. She called the neighbors for help. They called the Red Cross of El Salvador, and within a few hours they were able to extract the baby, and although he was sick, he survived, and that was it. This was a sort of a human interest story that came out in the newspaper in El Salvador. And certainly, I'm sure most people here know this, but it's not unusual for the urge to have a bowel movement to be the first sign that a baby is coming. You can see in these pictures that when the baby's head is passing through the birth canal, it passes right over the rectum. And if you start to look, you actually find a tremendous number of news stories about babies who are born in toilets, even when women know they're in labor, even when they're in US hospitals under the care of doctors. In fact, I was telling this story to the mother of one of my daughter's friends, and she told me that the same thing had happened to her. She was in the hospital. She said she had to go to the bathroom. The doctor evaluated her. She was only 4 centimeters dilated. She went into the bathroom, and boom, the next thing you know, her baby was in the toilet. Of course, she was fine. It was in under medical care and in a very clean institution. But now let's fast forward to 2002 in El Salvador. In 2002, Mirna was 34 years old, and she was living in a poor province of Cuscantencingo, very poor family. She had to leave school in 4th grade to start working in a sewing factory. Since then, she had began to run a small store out of her home, and she was very enterprising. She was only 19 when she married Miguel, someone that her church had set her up with. And for the next 15 years, next 11 years, they had a relationship where she had a lot of miscarriages, but she never actually had a child, right? She had one child that was born but died shortly after birth. So this is, of course, what doctors will tell you, one of the key reasons to suspect that a pregnancy is going to be problematic is if the woman's had problematic pregnancies in the past. So Mirna certainly has had difficulties. When she was 34 years old, she realized she was pregnant again, and perhaps not surprisingly, she didn't tell many people outside of her initial family. She did not go to prenatal care because it cost a lot of money to travel there and to take time off work, and she had had so many disappointments in the past. She continued to have back pains and vaginal bleeding throughout the pregnancy, but she decided that she and her husband decided they were just going to leave this in the hands of God, as they tell it. In 2002, Mirna felt a sharp stomach pain. She thought she was about 7 months pregnant, and she went to the latrine, again, a pit toilet in the back of her house, to have what she thought would be a bowel movement. And to her horror, she accidentally birthed a very small fetus into the latrine. She returned to the house pale, traumatized, bleeding, sweating. She called her little sister, told her what happened. The little sister went and got the help of some neighbors. The neighbors came. One of them used a lasso. They managed to pull the baby out of the latrine, and the baby was crying. It did have sepsis and some problems, and it was very premature, but it was fine. However, when the police came, because the police had been notified that this was going on, one of the neighbors told Mirna that she was quite clear that Mirna had thrown the baby away on purpose because the baby was the result of an infidelity with her husband, that Mirna had told her her husband was sterile and couldn't get her pregnant, and her husband was going to know she was cheating if she was pregnant, and so she was sure that she threw this baby away. Of course, we already know, if you just look at Mirna's medical record, that this is wrong, right? She's been pregnant multiple times in the past. She's just had problematic pregnancies. The story gets weird here, but I only have 10 minutes, so I'm not going to go into it. But basically, this neighbor tells a story where she personally was the one who heard the baby cry and rescued the baby and gave it CPR and things that don't come out anywhere else in the testimony. But by the time that the baby and Mirna get to the hospital, doctors are actually writing on the baby's medical file that the baby had apparently been thrown away by her mother. When the case goes to court, Mirna was originally charged with abortion, but in the process of the trial, the charge was upgraded to attempted aggravated homicide. And doctors testified some of the most incredible things. For example, remember that Mirna said that she thought she was about 7 months pregnant. And of course, the way we know the gestation of a baby is we ask a woman when her last menstrual period was, and we do the math, right? The doctors who testified in the trial said that the baby was actually 8 months of gestation, but it was only the size of a 7th month fetus because it had suffered from intrauterine growth restriction. Okay, so first of all, they couldn't have known that, right? Because they didn't know when the date of the last period was. All they had to go off of was the size. And what they're saying is the size of the baby, the size of the fetus, the baby is 7 months of gestation, which is exactly what Myrna says. But they're saying it was 8 months of gestation. But the reason it had intrauterine growth restriction is because Myrna obviously didn't want the baby, and her not wanting the baby limited the oxygen and the ability of the baby to grow. So they use that as sort of evidence against her. Eventually, Myrna was found guilty of the attempted aggravated homicide of her daughter, and she was sentenced to 12 and a half years in prison. In November of 2014, the Supreme Court did finally issue a pardon to Myrna for this crime, but it was after she had served the entirety of her sentence. So this is Myrna now. She's in the black shirt here. It's her daughter, Briseida, who was born into the latrine, is in the middle, and her little sister, who went to get help, is to the side. And if you talk to Briseida now, who is actually an incredible student, she's a senior in high school right now, and say how this start affected her life, she'll tell you that she has absolutely no memory of being born into a latrine, that wasn't a problem. But the fact that her mother spent the first 13 years of her life in prison and that all the neighbors talked about her mother was a baby killer, that was really a traumatic aspect, not to mention the fact that Myrna lost everything. Her husband left her and took everything with her, her job, her spouse, her money. She jokes that he left a bed, right, but took the dishes, everything else. Myrna also lost her health. She's in need of a she's had some small heart attacks since then, and just the prison conditions were really hard on her health today. So I think the question here, and I know I'm already really close to out of time, so I'm going to go quickly, is what happened between 1991, when Maria Virtud had a baby into a latrine and it was a human interest story, and 2002, when Myrna was sentenced to 13 years for the attempted aggravated homicide of her baby. And part of the story is a legislative story. Prior to 1997 in El Salvador, abortion was only legal in these 3 circumstances, or causales. You could have an abortion when the life of the mother was at risk, when the pregnancy was the consequence of rape, or when the fetus had abnormalities incompatible with life outside the uterus. In 1997, there was a criminal code reform where they just essentially took out these exceptions. So there's no abortions, no exceptions, not even when the life of the mother is at risk. And in 1999, the same legislature passed a constitutional amendment saying that life begins at the moment of conception. But I think it's not enough just to talk about the change in the law for 2 reasons. One, most of these women, like Myrna, they did not have an abortion, right? Most of them were very far along in their pregnancies, and they had a difficult birth or an obstetrical emergency. And 2, we also can see that places like Nicaragua, right next door, have the same law now, but they're not sending women to jail, and women still are getting life-saving abortions. And so what I think is happening is that we have to look at what the political context, the public opinion has been around this. I've been analyzing 25 years of newspaper articles about this, and I'm going to go through this quickly. But what I basically find is that there was this powerful pro-life movement that started in the early 1990s in El Salvador. And when they started in 1994 to 1996, the story was really a story of these powerful global forces that are trying to force abortion onto El Salvador, right? They would say, this was really the narrative of Pope John Paul II in El Salvador. Those powerful global nations to the force didn't want poor brown people migrating to their countries. They were really trying to push population control on these countries and force them to kill their unborn babies. And you start to see this getting taken up in the legislature. It's interesting that 1994 is also when Newt Gingrich and the Republicans in the United States came up with the term partial birth abortion. So there's a lot happening in this time period. Once the elections came, it really became a sort of a story of right versus left. So the right-wing party, Arena, started saying the FMLN, the left-wing party, you can't vote for them because they'll kill unborn babies. Here's a newspaper article. If you can read it, it says, Arena proposes to defend the life of the unborn by criminalizing abortion, but the FMLN, in contrast, pronounces itself in favor of extracting fetuses, right? So really crazy language. But there's an interesting thing that happens right before the 1999 elections in El Salvador, and that's that the FMLN says to the feminists, look, we really want to be elected, we want to rule, we want to be the party of women, but if you keep touching abortion, we're never going to be elected. So let's just drop the issue. And so the FMLN kind of was told that they could vote their conscience. Most of them ended up upholding, all of them ended up upholding the criminalization of abortion. The feminist movement went silent on the issue, and yet these pro-life mobilizers kept getting out of bed every day looking for how they were going to fight for the lives of the unborn babies. And one of the things I've been arguing is that they needed that target, and they didn't have the FMLN, and they didn't have the feminists, and so they started sort of targeting these evil mothers, right? And so here's an article I found in 2001. The title is Crimes Without Punishment. In the introductory blurb of this first one says, the numbers of newborns being thrown into latrines, trash receptacles, or vacant lots by their own mothers is alarming. The authorities need to capture these women red-handed to process them for aggravated homicide, but to the contrary, these crimes never come to light and they're given complete immunity. And then the story starts. Imagine yourself naked, tied at the hands and feet without being able to speak or see. Suddenly you feel yourself being thrown into a hole, and upon falling to the bottom, you realize you're surrounded by feces and urine. Little by little, you begin to drown. Soon, various insects like cockroaches begin to climb on your body. Worms and rats begin to bite you and pulling off your skin, and nobody hears your painful cries, right? And so there's no statistics at all, but this article says that, thousands of babies are finding themselves in this fate in El Salvador. Quickly, the one at the bottom says histories of hearts and stone. And the little sub thing under that says, they're human beings that waited 9 months in their mother's wombs for the hands of a sweet mother, but what they found instead were the talons of soulless women, right? So it was a very sort of powerful language that came. I also found some pressure to prosecute. This is in 2003. You see the Human Rights Ombudsman at the bottom, who has started an actual part of the Ombudsman's Office for Human Rights for the human rights of the unborn, and she's pressuring the head of the police and the Attorney General to do more to shut down abortion clinics, and they're saying we're trying, we're doing all we can. There's some incredible stories about this as well, but what they actually say here is that if you want us to actually stop abortions, you have to make the law even stricter. You have to make intention to abort a crime, and then we can get those women for abortion. Really quickly, my students and I have now found 71 cases like this. We've actually found over 80 now, which is why I don't want you to cite this, because the numbers keep changing. But what you can see in the first column is that most of these women are initially charged with abortion, and then over time, the charges get upgraded to attempted or aggravated homicide. And whereas the abortion charges are not often found guilty, the aggravated homicide, 3/4 of those are found guilty, and they're getting an average of 29 years in prison for this. This basically says that they're very young women with low education working in the jobs that don't give them any protections, oftentimes as domestic workers, and they oftentimes are already mothers at the time of the incident, and they typically almost always require a public defender. This is just the 41 women who were found guilty. Most of them are turned into they are reported to the police by the healthcare professional who treats them in the moment of emergency. So someone finds them bleeding, unconscious, takes them to the hospital. The doctors have been told that if they don't report a suspected abortion, that they will be guilty of being an accomplice under the law, and they call to report a suspected abortion, and then that starts the process that they get upgraded to aggravated homicide. I don't have time to talk about this. Suffice it to say that women do die in the hospitals because they don't get access to abortion. But I think what's more interesting in some ways, or more common, is that women who have fetal malformations that are incompatible with life, actually, we don't know what happens in those pregnancies after about 20 weeks, because in most of the world, those pregnancies are interrupted. And we're starting to find that those pregnancies, if you let a woman go to the full 40 weeks, that there are tremendous complications on women's bodies. And young girls, 18 years old, suddenly are having their uteruses removed, and other kinds of bodily mutilations that happen with these pregnancies. So it's not just a matter of life, but actually sort of bodily integrity as well. And so I think, to sum up, because I'm way over time, the changes in the law are horrific, and we need to change the law back. But I think what El Salvador shows us, both in terms of the timing when women started to go to jail and in comparing El Salvador to other nations, is that it's not just the laws, but it's this accompanying narrative. It's the fact that the police officers and the doctors and the judges all actually operate in the society where these narratives of these evil women are circulating, and that has had a really profound effect on how the police investigate the crime scene of a uterus and how the doctors decide whether or not to report a patient, and how judges hear the cases. And so if we change the law, I think obviously lives would be saved, particularly in hospitals, but I think the practices outlined here that have become very institutionalized in the criminal justice system are unlikely to change, in part because most of these women didn't have abortions in the first place, but also because we've now institutionalized these understandings of what constitutes a crime. And I think there's also, I should say, just when you say life begins at the moment of conception, it becomes very, very difficult to determine what's the difference between abortion and homicide, right? And so there's a lot of difficulty going on here that's really being borne on the backs of low-income, uneducated women. Thank you very much.
I'm not going to use slides, so we can do whatever we need to do to not do that. Hello, everyone. I'm very honored to be here and to be part of this important discussion. Thank you, Allie. Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Jocelyn, for that great talk. It has been very inspiring to hear about the significant legal changes in Mexico and in the European Court. But I think, or no, and, not but, and what Jocelyn and I are doing is talking about the importance of thinking outside the law and to the politics of abortion. So first, I want to say that I think it's really important to ground these discussions in the lived experiences of people who are seeking abortions, sometimes getting them, a lot of times not. And the sort of larger global reality, which is that 1 in 4 pregnancies end in induced abortion. In developed countries, it is one of the safest medical procedures. But half of all abortions in the world are still unsafe. The World Health Organization estimates about 22 million a year, which is probably a very low estimate, mostly in Africa and Latin America, which have the highest rates of maternal mortality from unsafe abortion. This is, the thing I'm about to say, I think, is the most important thing. If you take away nothing else, take this away. That no person today, anywhere in the world, should die from an unsafe abortion. This is not a disease without a cure. These people are dying from, they're being murdered by the law and by poor health systems. So we have the means to completely eradicate maternal mortality from abortion, and we're just not doing it. Even where abortion laws are liberalized, as we have heard a bit in the earlier panels, but I want to really focus on it. My political work and most of my adult life has been spent in this tremendous chasm between formal, legal, constitutional rights and whether you can access them, whether you can have an abortion. And as we heard earlier today, there is no affirmative duty in the United States for abortion to be provided. And so many people are living with the consequences of the restrictions. Yes, we are a legal system that's built on precedent, but right now I think most reproductive health rights and justice advocates are much more focused on the fragility of precedent rather than its staying power. And I'm going to just quickly run through the kinds of restrictions, and I don't want to rest with the restrictions. I want to turn to the importance of different kinds of resistance outside the law. So restrictions on funding, this was just this week, was the 43rd anniversary of the restriction ban on federal funding for abortion. It's called the Hyde Amendment. It came just 3 years after legalization. And for poor women and who are disproportionately in this country, women of color, that was pretty much their right to legal abortion not being upheld. Parental involvement laws, which require that a parent be informed or give consent, So-called informed consent, which is forcing doctors to lie, to tell people that abortion causes mental health problems and breast cancer. The expansion of religious refusals. The opponents of abortion call these conscience clauses, but really they are refusals based on religion of the provider, and the religion of the pregnant person doesn't seem so important. Targeted restrictions of abortion providers. These are so-called trap laws. These are medically unnecessary hyper-regulations of abortion clinics, which cause a lot of clinics to close because they can't afford to stay open. And finally, and tremendously emboldened by the current political situation in the United States and the occupant of the White House, the anti-abortion movement is getting bolder in terms of the kinds of laws it's trying to pass. So passing bans as early as 6 weeks of pregnancy, which probably you all know is before most people actually know they are pregnant. So if you're banning at 6 weeks, you're effectively banning all abortion. And lastly, the restrictions on telemedicine. We have just learned that about 40% of abortions in the US are abortions with medicines, with pills. And a combination of mifepristone and misoprostol. In much of the world, misoprostol alone is used, and I'm not going to talk much about that, but I think people can ask about it if they want. And so the restrictions on telemedicine are really aimed at trying to shut down what is becoming increasingly common abortion practice. So what to do about all, these are all the trends in restricting abortions, which we are facing as legal challenges to legal abortion in the United States. So I want to first do say some things about what it means to ground abortion in real people's lives. I think the first thing it tells us, I think these are guides to how we should think and act. So it tells us that we need to look intersectionally to understand that the people who are most vulnerable because of their class, their race, their age, their gender and sexual identity are the people who are most harmed by all the restrictions. People with economic security can almost always get an abortion anywhere in the world, no matter what the law. So really what we're talking about is using the bodies of the most vulnerable people in society as political footballs in this battle. Secondly, increasingly activists are adopting a reproductive justice framework which brings abortion into the realm of human rights and social justice. It's a broad approach, and I just want to read something from a press release. A court just blocked a 6-week ban in Georgia. It's not the end of the story, so it's not, it's going to come back. But the press release, which was issued by Sister Song, Women of Color for Reproductive Justice, reads very differently from the way these things have usually read. It says, "We refuse to go back to days where bodies are controlled by the state, and we oppose any policy violating bodily autonomy and human rights." So invoking these very broad, it's not using the language of choice, right? It's going for a much bigger understanding of where abortion sits in the lives of people. I want to say that a lot of people are afraid of broadening the frame for abortion. People especially of my generation who are afraid that if you get too broad, you're abandoning the fight for abortion. And really, I don't see it that way. I think emphasizing the interconnections of how abortion takes you to all of these other rights and needs is actually going to protect it more. And this, to me, takes, I think, a really obvious point, but sometimes an obvious point has to be belabored. The need or demand for abortion does not change with restricting it by law. That is so obvious everywhere in the world and here too. All it does is either force people to have babies that they did not plan or want to have, and pregnancies that they consider unsupportable, or to go outside the law, sometimes having a dangerous procedure or not. So I want to now move to the importance of feminist activism outside the formal medical system and often outside the law. And just one last thing about the courts. I wish I could adopt all the judges we'd heard from this morning and put them on the Supreme Court of the United States, but that is not going to happen. And right now, we're really afraid of our Supreme Court. We don't want to take cases to it because it's a dangerous place. So the call, and I hear all of these facts and cases and the picture of abortion globally. I actually hear this as a call to action. And I think that we see that you can act in many different ways to achieve reproductive health rights and justice. But in order to do that, you really need to go beyond the law. It is actually the activism that motivates the changes in the law. And unfortunately, in this country, there's been a lot of persistent activism by the opponents of abortion. I think it's also a time for really bold action. Many of us some of us in this room, it's a young crowd, spent a lot of time in the 80s and 90s outside of abortion clinics doing what was called clinic defense, which is putting our bodies in front of the clinics. I was thinking when you gave that admonition in the beginning, whether it was directed at us, the thing about not being disruptive, we were disruptive because we were trying to ensure that people could get what they needed against others who were trying to shut the system down. And I think that same determination and commitment to people being able to bodily integrity, bodily autonomy, people being able to manage their own reproductive lives and future. I think that is what is driving today the activists who are assisting people in self-managing their abortion with pills. So there is abortion with pills inside the medical system, and then there is abortion with pills outside the medical system. You can buy them on the internet. You can find the protocols on the World Health Organization's website. You can Google SAS, S-A-S-S, self-managed abortion, safe and supported, to find this out. And so many countries in the world, no matter what the status of abortion, advocates are supporting people in this way. 20 countries have hotlines, even ones where abortion is highly restricted. Women Help Women and something called WOW, Women on Web, work with local networks to distribute pills. These pills, I should say, are in most states in the United States highly regulated and are a felony. So this is really, it is a place where law could change and policy. It does involve risk, but again, the risks here are not risks of the medical aspects of abortion or the biological aspects. They're risks imposed by law. For those of you in the audience who are going to be lawyers, there's a lot to do. You can work directly with individuals and advocates. 21 people in the United States have been prosecuted in the way that Jocelyn describes for allegedly self-managing their abortion or having miscarriages. And I think there's a group called If, When, How, these are activist lawyers who are defending women who are in that situation. And I just want to close by reminding us, September 28th was the day of action for safe abortion everywhere. I feel like all over the world, people are answering the call to action, which gives me hope and inspiration. September 28th was picked. It started in Brazil because it was the day that slavery ended in Brazil. And compelling someone to carry a pregnancy to term against their will is, in effect, a form of slavery. Thank you.
Do we have time for a couple questions? Maybe one?
And also, if you would like to. Yeah, please.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, how about we take one question, then I have a bunch to add, so let's take a question, then we can weave it in from there. Yeah, go ahead.
Minerva Rivas, a visiting fellow at the Petrie-Flom Center. I have a question that I've really listened with loads of attention, and so your very inspiring talks, and thank you for sharing. And I have a question that is also relevant to the previous panel, and it's to do with intersectional issues in abortion. As you rightly mentioned, this has a disproportionate effect in the most vulnerable part of the population. And also in what are your thoughts even if legislation is achieved, and we know that obstetric violence is a big issue in Latin America. Institutional discrimination is a big issue in Latin America, and physicians and other health professionals imposing their views despite the law is something that is very difficult to address and very difficult to battle. And yeah, I would like to have, if you could elaborate on that, please.
Thank you, excellent question. One of the things that I have been noticing in evaluating the many court cases with these women is that there's definitely an issue of discrimination, but there's also definitely an issue of training, right? And so for the case of Imelda recently, one of the things that the prosecution was arguing, or excuse me, the medicina legal, so like the state forensics expert supposedly was arguing. They said that there's no way that that an umbilical cord would rupture in a situation where a woman sat down like this. And therefore, she had to have cut the umbilical cord with a knife or with scissors, and therefore that proves that she's guilty, right? So all I had to do, I'm a sociologist, right? But I've learned tremendous things. So one of the things I do is I just go to the PubMed database and I put in rupture of umbilical cord, and 17 articles come up that all say that an umbilical cord would absolutely break in this situation. There's even like diagrams of, they've had all these umbilical cords donated and they're stretching them to see when they'll break and things like this. And so what I do is I take those relevant parts and I translate them into Spanish and I send them off to be used in the defense of these women. So I think, and when you start looking into it, you realize that none of the forensic pathologists in the court systems in El Salvador have ever had any training in forensic pathology, which is actually a huge problem in the United States as well. We have a huge dearth of forensic pathologists in the United States. So you have people who have no training, they don't have access to PubMed, and they have to come up with their arguments. And so that's when these very discriminatory ideas about gender that are informed by what's going on in the public, I think, come into the court situation. I don't know if you've heard of the case of Evelyn. She's been in the news a lot lately. The forensic pathologist in that case actually made a statement that says a woman cannot give birth sitting down, right? Like they actually are coming up with birthing chairs right now so that you can give birth sitting down, because it's one of the best. So I think there's, it is a huge problem. I'm sorry, there you are, thank you. It is a huge problem, right? It's not just combating the discrimination, it's combating training. And I want to make clear that this is not just in Latin American countries, this is true in our nation as well. And I think this is also a call for us as universities, right? Like what I've found in these cases is that I need to get this forensic pathologist and this psychologist and this OBGYN to come together and to read these cases and to help us fight for these women. But I've also been able to sort of pull that information into training programs. And is there a way that we can use Harvard X, or that we can use the resources of the law school to make the information that's so easily accessible to us more accessible to the people who use it on the ground in the US and abroad, so that when there is that one person in the office who says, that doesn't really sound right to me, that an umbilical cord can't break, that they will actually have the ability to go get that information themselves. And so I'd like us to think about ways that information could be better distributed. It is also a problem, I think, in El Salvador that they don't train anyone how to do an abortion anymore. So even in the cases when the life of a woman is at risk, and they get some sort of permission to interrupt the pregnancy, the only option they have is they give her Pitocin, and they instigate an early labor, which is much more difficult for the body than other aspects.
Yes to all of that, and I think we just really do have to continue to call out the devaluation of women's bodies, women's ability to make their own decisions. I was struck this case, there was a case recently this summer of a woman named Marsha Jones in Alabama, and she was in an argument with another woman. The other woman shot her in her pregnant stomach, and then Marsha was charged with damage to the fetus because they said she started the fight. So to me, what this says more than anything is that even a dead fetus is more worthy, has more value than a living woman. So I guess I think a lot of this is, we can help by giving information and knowledge, but until we completely destabilize the system, which devalues the ability of a person who is pregnant to make their own decisions about their lives, I don't think we're going to get very far. And for me, I mean, I'm sort of heartened to hear about the invoking bodily autonomy and human rights. You don't hear that in U.S. courts, but you know, there's a new generation here, so you go get them.
For me, what this question brings up is the systemness of the abortion issue, and I think what we've done is when we've discussed abortion as whether or not women should have the right to decide whether or not they can do it, the public health and healthcare system has then extracted itself from the conversation and it's kind of left it up, well, then when the judges decide what to do, then we can figure out what we do. In the meantime, as we've seen, women aren't getting the services. And from a clinical perspective, you know, when you say doctors in El Salvador don't know how to do abortions, I would say that across the world, midwives and nurses are not trained to do abortions.
Right.
It's a doctor thing. You have to be a doctor to administer 4 pills of misoprostol, which apparently require a high level of training. Canada and the US, the midwifery associations have argued this and are trying to legislate an expansion in prescriptive capacity to be able to prescribe misoprostol, but heaven forbid that we actually learn how to do a manual vacuum aspiration. We can actually do a delivery, but we can't do a manual vacuum aspiration. And this also has to do with who's going to the hospital. In order to train to do any clinical procedure, you need to be able to do it, and do it a lot. When I was trained, I was trained in a place where I did 17 abortions a day, and that's a lot. And by the end of 2 weeks, I pretty much knew what I was doing. Unless you have that level of clinical experience, you're not going to be a safe provider. And if you're working in isolation in a place where your colleagues are looking at you and they're pressuring you not to do this. I get calls all the time from women in hospitals in Mexico that are like, I've been sitting here for 3 days bleeding and nobody's taking care of me. And they will have to sign to leave the hospital and come to a place where we can finish the miscarriage or the abortion or whatever you want to call it. In terms of systemness too, I think that removing it from the sphere of public health, we've actually removed it we've removed the conversation of what happens when people fall in the cracks between the legal decision and the actual clinical access to it. So just as you were saying, Marlene, between the time that the courts are deciding, the years are passing, and every month women are getting pregnant. And I want to call into that, just mention the fact that not only is it intersectional, where it's obvious that the most vulnerable are most affected by this, and I just want to point out an example. In the highlands of Chiapas, women don't monitor their period, usually because they're breastfeeding from the time they're 15 till about the time they go into menopause. Their periods are pretty irregular. They, during the coffee season, we'll definitely see the ovulation happens less because they're working long hours and eating a lot less. It's very difficult to realize that you're pregnant. There aren't pregnancy tests at CVS because there aren't that many pharmacies. You wouldn't spend your money on a pregnancy. By the time Indigenous women in the highlands realize that they're pregnant, they're very far along. And by the time they start asking in secret a network, where can I go? Can you drive me somewhere? Where can I go where I won't die because I have 4 other kids, because the coffee season is coming up. By the time women are actually accessing care, they're very, very far along in their pregnancy. So again, going back to the systemness, it's not just about ensuring access, it's ensuring that access is tangible in the way that we understand what conception is, what pregnancy is, and when and how and where do you access that care as quickly as possible. We've talked a lot about time.
The only thing, and another thing to add in terms of the public health professionals, and in El Salvador, in the United States, in South Carolina, where women are prosecuted for taking illegal drugs while pregnant, it's doctors and nurses and people who are working in the hospital who are turning these people in. And so part of the educational process here is again, not just knowledge and information, but values and morality, and sort of centering people, and so that medical professionals don't actually feel so emboldened to take charge of decisions, over other people's bodies and lives.
We certainly, in the world of maternal and sexual and reproductive health, we feel the need to have opinions about all the processes that women go through, which doesn't happen in oncology or,
Right, exactly,
you know,
exactly.
in other fields. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay. I do want to, as a matter of closing, I do want to highlight that we're all involved in this, and to me this is such a global issue. And I'm going to cite another example. There is a network in Mexico that was actually mentioned by one of the justices. There's a hotline in Mexico where you can call, and they will get you to Mexico City, get you to a safe abortion, and get you home. That service is completely free. It's completely anonymous, and you actually get to choose what clinic you go to. It can be public or private. You get an abortion doula who's with you the whole time, and you get a hotel room the night before so that you can rest if you actually have time. Most of the women spend the night on the bus coming to Mexico City and then go home as quickly as possible because they have jobs and children. That network is funded by donors in the US.
Right.
And it only exists because of donors in the US. If those donors need to start funding the same network to exist in the US, it probably will stop existing in Mexico. The reason that we get mifepristone is because there's a donor in London that sends it through suitcases, and we get it. Until it was recently legalized in Mexico, but until then, people were bringing the mifepristone in suitcases, and we used to send misoprostol to Chile, stuck on T-shirts so that it would get through the mail to midwives and doctors there. So I just want to talk about that, you know, Women on Waves is a perfect example of this, but all of us are implicated in the global capacity, restriction, access to whether or not women die of an abortion or they actually survive it.
Right, and the network of abortion funds that I work with in the US, and the Maria Fund is part of that network, and basically it's doing what the state doesn't do. Unlike in other places where abortion is made legal and then it becomes an affirmative part of the public health system, in the US, having the right to an abortion never meant that you had the right to access abortion. So again, that discrepancy between the two means that private actors and activists are trying to fill the gap, which is enormous. You can't do what the state should do in these cases. So I think again, it's like until we are living in that world of justice and reproductive justice, where all these things are available and paid for, all of us need to do what we can do to make it happen. Thank you. Thank you, Kristen.
So thank you, everybody, for being here this morning. I think it was a
Thank
very
you,
productive
Christine.
discussion.
Thank you. It's great.
So
Can we go down?
I really want to thank that last panel for bringing to life some of the issues that we've been discussing throughout the morning with extremely passionate and articulate stories. I think it's throughout the morning we've seen that this issue has so many different facets from which you can understand it. And that looking at it sometimes from the local, very contextual perspective to the global trends. It's not just the women's movement and the funding in terms of progressive abortion forces, but also the anti-abortion forces and the forces that are at the European Center for Law and Justice or the American Center for Law and Justice, in which the president's personal lawyer sits, foment anti-abortion legislation that is cut and pasted and other funding of networks. I think it's also brought to light the kind of inextricable relationship between how we think about health policy and health system organization and the legal frameworks that organize that, but also the gaps between permissive legislation and effective enjoyment of women's rights in practice. And finally, I want to just underscore what a privilege it has been to hear sitting justices of the Mexican Supreme Court speak so candidly and openly about the work that they are doing now and faces them now, and to have Judge Sayo join in that conversation. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking you.